Welcome to the Treasury Update Podcast, Coffee Break Sessions, presented by Strategic Treasurer. The show where we cover foundational topics and core Treasury issues in about the same amount of time it takes you to drink your cup of coffee. I'll be your host, Jonathan, Media Production Specialist here at Strategic Treasurer, so sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. Today, we're continuing the FDIC and SIPC insurance conversation, but this time we're with Paul Galloway, Senior Director Advisory Services at Strategic Treasurer. Welcome back to the show, Paul.
Yeah, thanks, John.
The last few conversations with Craig, we covered what FDIC and SIPC are and how they're different. If you haven't listened to those, go back and check them out. Today, I wanted to ask you, Paul, if there's any alternatives or scenarios where they might not apply.
Yeah, it's a great question, John. The thing is with these, there's really not alternatives to it. So it's not like you can go out and shop around for FDIC or SIPC. That's not what you do. They're there. They exist. They have to be in place. So there's really not a direct alternative. I would like to focus on for our conversation today is more about how do you manage balances that you have in those types of accounts. Bank accounts with banks, investments. How do you manage it? I think that's really what matters, and that's what I would consider, quote unquote, an alternative to it, meaning you can have the coverage that you need if you manage it appropriately.
Okay, so no direct competition. How does someone adjust their plan so that they can be fully covered? And I'm especially interested on your thoughts on coverage of the investments. But if you could go into both the bank account side and the brokerage side.
So let's take bank accounts to begin with. So there is a level at which FDIC covers. Most people understand that $250,000 at a bank is covered under this insurance. If something was happened to the bank, your bank balances would be covered up to that amount. If counterparty risk is an issue for you as a treasurer, there are alternatives to managing the balances that you have at banks. So instead of having, millions of dollars in balances at a particular bank, you may take those funds and you could invest them in a portfolio of CDs at other banks. That's time consuming. It takes time to do that. You would have to manage all that. As an alternative, there are short-term pooled investment funds where there are companies out there that will take your millions of dollars and they will invest in these bank CDs up to the FDIC limit. And so they'll do that on behalf of you and also provide liquidity. So if you have liquidity needs, you're able to get the cash that you need. There are limits and constraints to that, like any other fund that would be out there, but you can do that. You also will have that coverage for all those dollars up to the limit, $250,000, because they won't go beyond $250,000 with any particular counterparty that they're making investments in. There are some other depository accounts that allow you similar type of investments, not exactly the same as these fund companies, but similar.
Okay. And insured deposit accounts, is that one of them?
Definitely ones that you can utilize as part of your portfolio or your levers to manage that FDIC coverage. And you can get a good yield in those accounts.
Is that pretty common to move towards insured deposit accounts or other accounts like that now that people are coming into the workforce that want things automated, or at least the manual tasks pushed downstream some? Do you see a lot of growth coming in that area?
It depends. I think there's still a lot of organizations out there that they aren't overly concerned about that if they're with your tier 1, tier 2 banks. So I think the level of angst around, hey, I got to watch my limits with those larger banks tends to be less, perhaps more with smaller, more localized banks. That's where it comes into play. Some organizations are just risk adverse. And so in those instances, using an IDC account or one of these other fund companies that invest in portfolio or consortium of CDs with banks up to the FDIC limit, these are options. When you look at the market the way it is right now, we still have persistent inflation. It's still unclear whether we're going to have a soft landing or have a mild recession. About a year ago, we started having some bank failures. When those kinds of things happen, organizations tend to look for options to diversify so that they can protect themselves. They look at their bank balances. Again, not everybody does that, but there definitely are treasurers out there with an eye towards that.
Yeah, they either look at their bank balance and say, we need to make some changes, or they look at what the FDIC did and they say, everything's insured.
Yeah, they gotta pay attention to the everything is insured part, because it may not be. It depends on what their balances are.
Okay, so on the investment side, are there accounts that you can open up to diversify your investments through different brokers in case if you're over the limits on SIPC?
Yeah, I mean, you could diversify amongst managers, and that's definitely an approach you can take. You know, what happens with a lot of organizations, though, John, is that when it comes to corporates, especially of the larger size, medium to large size organizations, they tend to have large pools of investments. And so diversification, it helps, right? It helps to diversify amongst managers. But it also helps to ensure that you have belt and suspenders, meaning you have the appropriate investment guidelines in place that dictate the amount of risk that your organization is able to take. You do reviews of your managers to ensure that they're adhering to the investment guidelines. You review your portfolios on a regular basis. You understand the credit risk that's in the portfolio. If you're using managers and you're doing in-house management yourself, you're going to take the same approaches. You got to make sure you're monitoring. You got to do the work on the credit side. You got to diversify. Hedging may be something that you engage in as well. We talked about the use of derivatives to offset risks, whether it's currency, interest rate, or exposure to the market. You can utilize these tools to help diversify and hedge the risk associated with something goes wrong or something goes sideways. And that helps insulate you or your portfolio. So these are things that lots of companies do today, whether in-house or through use of outside managers.
Okay. Well, thank you for sharing your thoughts today. You have anything else you want to leave the listeners with?
No, I think this is a good topic. This is definitely something, you know, as a treasurer should be front of mind. You should be thinking about these things, what the impacts might be to your organization. Like I said, a lot of companies, a lot of treasurers, they're doing this stuff today.
Cool. Thank you. To our listeners, remember to tune back every first and third Thursday for another episode of the Coffee Break Sessions.
This podcast is provided for informational purposes only, and statements made by Strategic Treasurer LLC on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, consulting, or tax advice. For more information, visit and bookmark strategictreasurer.com.